Dr. Srila Roy has kindly agreed to join us, and we're very happy and excited to be able to listen to her. She is Associate Professor of Sociology and chairs Development Studies at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. I was looking her profile up and trying to get a taste of her writings, and it's really incredible the amount of writing she has done on so many different aspects of feminism, women's movements, women's empowerment, and closely following, it sounds like also from the way she writes, on the ground involvement and experience of contemporary developments in India. She is the author of Remembering Revolution, Gender, Violence and Subjectivity in India's Naxalbari Movement from 2012, editor of New South Asian Feminisms, and co-editor of New Subaltern Politics, Reconceptualizing Hegemony and Resistance in Contemporary India from 2015. Her second monograph, maybe she'll tell us about it, is I think on the way and soon going to hit the book stands on queer feminist politics in liberalized India with Duke University Press. And she has co-edited a volume on the Me Too hashtag in India and South Africa. So another fascinating dimension with the sort of comparative contextual dimension of India and South Africa. At her university, she leads a project called Governing Intimacies, supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And this promotes new scholarship on gender and sexuality, again, with that fascinating comparison of South Africa and India, both as post-colonial contexts. And I looked up the website. There's a fascinating webinar series, which is another thing that can keep us going for the next few months. I see you have a series of events lined up till November. Today, she has kindly accepted to join us, and she'll talk to us on the topic, and the title which she has given is Queer Feminist Politics in Neoliberal India, Moving Forward, Feeling Backward. And I will invite her to take the floor for about 40 minutes. And after her, we'll also invite Professor Eileen Connolly, who is joining us today as well. And then I'll take back some control. And also, please invite the audience to send in questions via the Q&A throughout the session. Thank you very much. Please, Dr. Srila.
So just to say thank you so much for the invitation from yourself and from Orpita and from the Institute, and also for all your kindness in the last couple of, your patience, your kindness in the last weeks and days. And I think they very much reflect the spirit of this conference, which, let's face it, is taking place under very, very difficult circumstances. And I mean, I saw it in the program, but today when I attended, I managed to attend briefly one session and one full session just before. And I was just so struck by how all the presenters are actually, sitting in India, where I actually just left and came back, to the safety of Johannesburg. And it's, I mean, it's just absolutely inspiring that, through all of this, we're able to focus intellectually, engage in these kind of robust debates and hold the space together. So, thank you very much to the Institute and all the presenters for making this possible for all of us. Okay, so I'm going to be very old-fashioned and read almost like, from paper, like mimicking how I would in an actual conference. And I'm afraid some of it might just seem like the middle of a story, because I am extracting, from this new book that you mentioned. So if it feels like that, obviously I'd be very happy, to come back to it in the Q&A and to try and catch you up to speed on other bits of this story. Okay, so my talk's going to draw on this book that I'm just completing, and Jivanta, you're being a lot more optimistic than I am that it's going to see the light of day soon. I hope so. And the book is ostensibly about the terrain of queer feminist politics in the period we know in India as economic liberalization. So I started the project really to know what this critical juncture in India's post-independent history meant for existing social movements like the Indian women's movement, but also for newer mobilizations around sexuality and sexual rights in particular. So the book, which is provisionally titled Changing the Subject, Queer and Feminist Politics in Liberalized India, studies the present state of feminism in India through distinct forms of queer and non-queer feminist activism that emerged and evolved since the 1990s. So just to sort of flag that a little bit more, I think in recent times, we've had a lot of work which looks at sexual politics, sex workers' mobilizations and rights, or issues around trans communities, and indeed, LGBT more generally. But I'm looking, or my project is looking across feminist and feminist queer spaces. So I hope that makes it sort of interesting and distinctive. So over the course of a decade, I followed two organizations in West Bengal quite closely. One was a queer feminist organization working with LBT communities, quite groundedly urban and metropolitan, and the other focusing on women's empowerment through microfinance and rights work, which was in the rural areas. And the idea was to use these two case studies, as it were, to look at the implications, or the very concrete implications of neoliberal restructuring on activist and developmental interventions or organizing in India. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the queer feminist organization alone, the trajectory of which was inseparable from that of India's globalization and neoliberalism, but also informed by the affective weight of past feminisms. This produced what I call, after Heather Love, a backward-looking queer feminist activism at a time of rapid expansion and moving forward in queer organizing and indeed queer livability in India. While Love cautions against queer temporalities that repress what she calls, and I quote, the stubborn negativity of the past in a rush to move forward to queer success and positivity, I show how the turn to the past can also prove constraining for radical politics, as arguments that draw on, for instance, Wendy Brown's critiques of left melancholia have long established. I think my bigger point is to suggest that what we might read and feel too quickly as the practices and impact of global neoliberalism, or NGOization, a term I'll unpack a little bit, have a deep historical structure that shapes contemporary forms of activist and development organizing and subjectivities in very specific grounded locales. Now, we know that the 1990s was a watershed decade in India. It coincided with the opening up of the Indian economy and the introduction of neoliberal economic reforms and processes that have come to be known as liberalization. We also know that it was in this historical conjuncture that a certain institutionalization of feminist concerns took place, such as the articulation of gender and sexual rights in a language of consumer freedoms, enterprise and empowerment, closely aligned with the interests of the state, the market, global development, and often, or rather invariably, spearheaded by new transnational formations like NGOs. Indeed, NGOs fundamentally transformed the organizing of, or the structure rather, of Indian feminism from the autonomous formations of the 1970s and 80s to donor-driven ones in the 1990s, to put it very crudely. For many activists and academics, these changes signified something sinister, namely the co-option of the Indian women's movement by external agents and the dilution of its radical edge. And indeed, my very initial motivation to do this project was to explore this idea of what is being co-opted, right? That was really my primary, my primary sense of what is going on here. What has been co-opted? What was it before? And what is that process now producing? What has transformed, as it were? Activists in India, activists and academics in India, much like counterparts in the global south elsewhere, saw NGOs as being far more accountable to their foreign donors than to communities at the grassroots in whose name they claim to operate and, of course, attract funds. NGOs were also accused of actively depoliticizing development. And there are a number of studies, academic studies, that make these claims, and I'm not going to go into the details, but I'm very happy to refer you to them later on. India's economic liberalization signaled, however, more than mere co-option and depoliticization. It also amplified the visibility of gender and sexuality struggles in new and unexpected ways. The 1990s coincided with the global fight against HIV/AIDS, offering for the first time concrete material support for organizing around sexuality on behalf of and eventually by subaltern groups themselves. NGOs played a key role in how HIV/AIDS prevention programs politicized subaltern groups like sex workers, trans communities, including those who were historically marginalized by a thoroughly heteronormative and upper caste Indian women's movement. In brief, when it came to sexuality politics, the implications of these processes, these simultaneous processes of NGOization or transnationalism, globalization, and neoliberalism were more ambiguous than co-option fears allowed. In the book, I show the material transformations to queer feminist activism as it intersected with neoliberal logics and techniques of governance. These were evident in its scalar expansion from the local to the transnational, its professionalization and institutionalization, its imbrication in biopolitical fields of managing specific population groups, and its promotion of certain kinds of subjectivities and selves. But while the book maps these changes, it insists alongside critical scholarship, to which of course my thinking is indebted, that neoliberalism is no singular, pure, or unchanging formation. Accounts of the co-option of Indian feminism, of which there are many, can flatten the multiple spatiotemporalities at work in a specific time and place of neoliberalism. In other words, neoliberalism is not only experienced differently in distinct locales, where it is overlaid by other techniques and logics of regulation and rule, but it also evokes a plurality of times. And I think this claim is both quite obvious, but also hard to make, given the spatiotemporal and indeed affective stakes in producing the global neoliberal through a register of difference and discontinuity. In contrast, in the feminisms of the present, millennial feminisms, as I call them, I found more than an echo of older modes of governing subaltern subjects in the global South, including but not limited to colonial and nationalist logics, post-colonial development, and long, robust, and highly local feminist currents and wider political sensibilities. Millennial feminisms were haunted by past feminisms and the terms of political intelligibility in the kinds of authentic subjects that these had served to institutionalize and normalize. If anything, activists turned to the past in more explicit, even defensive ways in the face of threats of co-option in the present. They remained locked in a horizon of political possibility made available in a previous pre-liberalization era, even if only a few years earlier. The historical and cultural lineages that they relied on were also quintessentially local. And I emphasize that given that the moment of liberalization is so much associated with globalization. I show how it was regional idioms of feminist politics that accrued activists, both queer and non-queer, the greatest forms of legitimacy and value. Hauntings of this kind complicate easy assessments of the present as succeeding the past, or the global as disseminating the local. Lesbian hauntings are what Navanita Mokkal recently turns to show how loss and mourning of actual lesbian lives in India offers an alternative and more locally grounded politics of sexuality than liberal sexual identity politics. The lesbian is a spectral figure par excellence, who has long haunted the boundaries of mainstream feminism and the stories it tells about itself. There are indeed multiple hauntings and ghostly figures at play in the queer and non-queer feminist sites I explore in the book, but with more messy and ambivalent effects than seductive readings of feminist and lesbian hauntings might allow. Okay, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to flesh out some of these provocations by providing you a glimpse into the queer feminist organizing of Sappho for Equality, or SFE. The book maps the story of SFE and its roots in a support group called Sappho that stretches across the first 2 decades of the new millennium, a period in which, as I said before, the very possibility of queer Indian life changed dramatically. In the short life of this one organization, we see how queer livability and political organizing in its name were actively enabled by and came to embody the expansive and co-opting potentials of the globalized, liberalized moment. These were tensions that such a self-reflexive set of queer feminist activists were far from oblivious to. As they grew from being a very small support group to a fully funded and highly regarded NGO, they remained committed to the radical potential of queer. Their entry into neoliberal governmentality through the circuits of transnational funding and LGBT identity politics did not amount to any straightforward or uncontested process of neoliberal co-option. Even as the organization's fortunes and ways of functioning transformed through the process of NGOization, for instance, multiple genealogies of the political did not disappear. Much changed and much endured. What perhaps endured most was a recent past of lesbian and feminist affect in politics with clear regional and cultural inflections. Even as they changed the subject of Indian feminism, queer feminist activists took recourse to the established political repertoires and cultures of the Indian women's movement, on which early lesbian groups had also relied for legitimacy and effect. To put it differently, queer activism was haunted by the ghosts of a feminist past at the dawn of a new queer future. A key spectral figure was that of the subaltern lesbian of rural West Bengal, or the Gramir May, who haunted what queer feminists could do and be in a new millennium. SFE's story is as much her story as it is of those who spoke on her behalf, in a sharp reiteration of long-standing relations between Bhadralok or middle-class activists and subaltern subjects. Sappho began as an emotional support group for same-sex desiring women in Kolkata on June 20th, 1999, on the back of the controversy around the film Fire, which I'll presume most of you are familiar with, and if not, look it up. Unlike Mumbai and Delhi, Kolkata did not witness the right-wing vandalism of local cinemas screening the film. But while these cities had witnessed informal networks and meetings for same-sex desiring women, Kolkata's lesbian women did not even live this kind of hidden life, thanks to a leftist political culture which was positively hostile to feminism and oblivious about sexuality. Local women's groups proved no different. They offered Sappho activists inclusion or acceptance, but in highly conditional and tensed ways. Sappho's fortunes and standing in a local feminist field changed substantially with the creation of Sappho for Equality a few years later. Registered as an NGO on October 30th, 2003, SFE embodied several related activist desires: the need to lobby the wider population in the struggle for decriminalization and destigmatization, and to move beyond providing support to demanding recognition and rights. SFE's formation and rise was also attributable to the fact that it was able to, as a registered NGO, access international funds, even as activists were highly wary of these processes and implications of NGOization. I just want to flag here that for a good long while, the organization maintained Sappho as a support group, which was only open to self-identifying LBT folk, mostly cis women, while Sappho for Equality functioned as an activist platform which was open to everyone, irrespective of how they self-identified. When I first met SFE members in 2009, the air was thick with criticisms of NGOs, with members resisting calling their organization an NGO and insisting it was an activist platform and not an NGO. In contrast to NGOs, SFE, they said, had grown organically out of the needs of the community and was motivated by passion and not any kind of professional interests or goals. Indeed, in both rhetoric and practice, SFE resembled far more the autonomous women's groups of the 1970s and 1980s. Then some of the much more professionalized and polished sexuality rights NGOs in the new millennium. Members were employed in full-time work or study elsewhere, and meetings were scheduled in the evenings and reliant on individual time and voluntary participation. In conversations with me, members regurgitated well-worn divisions between funded and non-funded politics, accusing both women and gay groups of selling out to donors. They insisted that they were not interested in expansion and that the organization, I quote again, should not feed us. Notwithstanding their critiques of autonomous Indian feminists as being homophobic and co-opted, SFE members reproduced the very political logics and affects that these feminists had normalized, now remobilized to ward off the impending dangers of co-option in a neoliberal era. Theirs was a strong instance of the generational passage of Indian feminism, of how activism could turn and even feel backward while moving forward. As another Kolkata-based queer activist once said to me, "Oh, Sappho, they're so second wave." From the start and in ways that intensified with NGOization and organizational expansion, SFE had clear aspirations and even anxieties around the reach of their activism. Is our activism city-center? Does it have no sway in rural areas? They would often ask. Their bilingual newsletter worked hard to show how it in fact did. And here's quite a typical example, and I'll quote from the newsletter. On 4th December, on the occasion of the Anti-Violence Fortnight for Women, we headed out with our leaflets to local trains running towards villages, where we directly talked to the daily passengers who came to the city to earn and go back every day. Our purpose through these passengers sending our messages that we, your urban friends, are by you. Perhaps as a result of it, a village girl from close to the Sundarbans stands at her door with her same-sex lover. So I was present for some internal meetings planning this train campaign in 2011. And I was quite struck by how it was done in the name of women's rights, violence against women, and of course, reaching the grassroots, and not around sexual rights per se. This rhetoric confirmed how international funds and donor speak had extended activist reach, while the constructs of the rural and the grassroots were as the originary sites of need, risk, and vulnerability had proved handy in attracting funds in the first place. But there was more at play here than the demands and politics of transnational funding, which sharply evoked older and far less global political sensibilities. Take, for instance, the issue of lesbian suicide, one that had constituted crucial grounds for queer feminist mobilizing in urban India since the mid-1980s. By employing a familiar feminist lens on violence against women, queer feminists tried to call attention to the urgency of lesbian vulnerability in very literal ways. And I think here it's sort of important to pause and flag that all of these, conditions which transformed lesbian organizing, whether it was the reliance on international funds or taking recourse to a language around violence against women and women's rights, were born out of compulsion and necessity, and not necessarily, aspirations or ambitions of organizational expansion. It was more like, these groups at a particular time had no choice in the context that they were. They couldn't get, state funding, for instance, so they had to get funding from transnational forces, and often that funding was through the language most amenable, which is around women's rights. That's just a caveat on the side. Rural lesbian suicides in particular epitomized Indian women's marginal social status at the intersection of sexuality and violence on the one hand, and poverty and underdevelopment on the other, in ways that also reassured mainstream Indian feminists that lesbianism was not a strictly metropolitan or middle-class issue. And again, here, this is, the density of the context in which, lesbian or queer activists are mobilizing, the fact that, again, they have to prove their legitimacy to mainstream non-queer feminists. Unlike in those early days, when Sappho activists had to often beg mainstream feminists to care about the loss of lesbian life, their institutionalized status and greater resources meant a more directly interventionist stance into the issue, and one that would also extend the reach and value of metrocentric queer feminist activism. So a significant instance of SFE's interventionist reach occurs at a time of the double suicides of two women called Shopna and Shucheta, who belonged to poor scheduled caste families and lived in a region of West Bengal that had become infamous as a site of popular resistance to forced industrialization and dispossession, namely Nondigram. Not only did core SFE members go to Nondigram to find out what had transpired, but they also produced a documentary film on the double suicides. On arriving at the village, they found a 6-page suicide note left by Shopna and the bodies of both women in the morgue, unclaimed by their respective families. The film, whose English title is "And the Unclaimed," also features activist conversations with the women's parents, local police, and other villagers, interspersed with the stories of abuse and discrimination suffered by SFE's own activists, who, just to remind you, were obviously urban and mostly upper caste. Critical readings of the film accused it of a classically Spivakian error, of speaking on behalf of the subaltern only to further silence her while fortifying the subjectivity and agency of those who cast themselves as her savior. In other words, the film effectively erased the Grameen, who left little trace outside of the desires of the urban activist, even when she attempted to speak in depth, much like in Spivak's original essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? The film also forced a degree of commonality between queer women, such that important caste class distinctions, besides the historical specificity of the region, was also erased. Shayan Bhattacharya, who makes this critique, tells us that hostile villagers stalled the shoot, and the documentary corroborates this by showing villagers asking the director to stop filming. And incidentally, this was also, for SFE activists, this again showed how, the women were living in a state of complete exile and horror within the community. Shraddha Chatterjee, who also reads the film critically, reports how some SFE members later regretted their entry into a space alien to them to place its inhabitants under investigation. This was a criticism that I heard from other queer activists in the city as well. But the ease with which urban individuals and groups could enter and exit the rural is unsurprising and not unique to such types of activism or even to this particular group or its members. It speaks to long histories of urban educated Indian activists, whether Gandhian or Maoists, returning to the village for social justice and development work. The regional specificity of such metrocentric mobility also matters. Bhadralok Bengali identity was historically constituted through specific imaginings of rural Bengal as a site of the primitive and pre-modern, full of purity, innocence, passivity, but also revolutionary promise that could be unleashed with external, i.e. urban middle-class intervention. Documenting anti-industrialization struggles in West Bengal, of which Nandigram was a significant site, Shorshit Mojumdar provides thick descriptions of how urban activists reproduced, and I quote, romanticized rurality through images of peasants and nature, and how these informed the subjectivities, interests, and agendas of a range of actors, including urban activists, leftists, and post-developmentalists. Post-colonial Indian feminism too established its early authenticity and relevance by speaking on behalf of poor rural others. The autonomous feminists of the 70s and the 80s, middle class, upper caste, urban, educated professional women of an leftist bent, threw their energies into filling the gap between state potential and its realization, turning their attention to poor women who had emerged the worst of by all accounts. What Mary John describes as a split between a feminist self comprised of middle-class metropolitan women and its object of investigation and reform, poor rural women at the grassroots, helped to establish the cultural authenticity and local legitimacy of an otherwise elite Western and seemingly irrelevant social movement. While these representational economies had a direct bearing on how poverty came to be prioritized over the politics of sexuality, they endured in the rhetoric, feelings, and modes of organizing of queer feminisms well before and after NGOization. So while transnational funds might have necessitated the expanding scales of activism, compulsions to reach, even save the Grameen at the grassroots exceeded the demands of neoliberal governmentality, showing important continuities across time and space. Whether in the name of lesbian rights, human rights, or development, activist efforts were also experienced in similarly objectifying ways, from villagers who refused the documentation of 2 local deaths to those who turned hostile in the face of outside attempts to save young rural women, as I also show in the book. To return to SFE, now as queer emerged as a political category at both local and transnational scales, the lesbian was also recast in specific ways which evoked the sensibilities of past forms of activism. Naisargi Dave, who maps an early terrain of the public emergence of lesbian and lesbian politics in Delhi, shows how in the political expansion of this early lesbian activism, the support group became the locus for meeting the needs of those lesbians who were construed as desiring but apolitical, in need of safety and support alone. Similarly, for many SFE members, the support group, SAFO, was vital for the purposes of outreach, especially beyond the limits of the urban. It had to exist for the Gramir Mein, the rural lesbian who had never seen another one like her. The separation between SAFO and SFE recalled, in other words, previous stakes in crafting authentic political subjectivity by keeping apart two imagined constituents of same-sex desiring women, queer and lesbian. Researcher and SFE member Niharika Banerjee quotes someone she calls Nina in an article published by her, a fellow SFE member, expressing these very commonly held sentiments, and I'll quote her in a bit of length. Suppose a girl who comes to know about Sappho for the first time, or comes to Sappho for the first time, think of her world. A girl from an interior village or suburb. She does not get to see two girls roaming around. She does not know about this life. Maybe she heard about Sappho and came here. Think of her fears and palpitations. So many thoughts are embedded in her mind. That she is something different, she is guilty, she is giving pain to her parents, she does not know what to do with her life, so much social pressure. When these girls come here, what do? You just want to give her some warmth, like a person freezing in cold. Just as a person freezing in cold gets back the warmth within when they come under a wrap. It is the same here. After a point, girls start feeling warm, stand up and face life in a different way. And as I said, these were very commonly articulated or commonly held sentiments amongst the people I met and I interviewed. This idea that if someone was coming from a non-metropolitan setting, they wouldn't, for instance, be interested in political or theoretical ideas. So they wouldn't be interested. I mean, one of the examples I was given, they wouldn't be interested in discussing homonormativity or homonationalism. They would mostly be interested in, finding a community. So this kind of separation between, what are certain political needs and what are apolitical needs. So to go back to SFE members like Nina, queer progress relied on a literal and symbolic journey from the rural, a space not conducive to same-sex livability, to the urban, the site of queer liberation, warmth, and of life itself. These kinds of metrocentric imaginaries that, as I said, were widely in circulation within, but well beyond this organization, and they've been documented also by Oni Datta in their work, posited very specific kinds of relationships with the empowered metropolitan queer being posited as savior of the vulnerable and victimized rural lesbian. Okay, I'm just coming to wrapping up. Now, when I first met SFE members, they made robust critiques of the NGOization of the Indian women's movement, vowing that their movement would never become a business in the same way. Once fully and successfully NGOized, and I can speak, I realized I've glossed over what that concretely looks like, and I can obviously fill you in later. But once that happened, they faced remarkably similar criticisms from amongst their own. One summer day at the Max Muller Bhavan in the heart of South Kolkata, where SFE hosted its annual film festival, I met some former SAFO members. They spoke of an early moment in the organization's history, where there was, and I quote, no money, no room, and we had so many ideas about what to do with money. In contrast, today we have funds, money, and resources. So what are we doing with it? They asked rhetorically, and concluded, money came and everything changed. Who is the space for today? English speaking, well-connected, internet savvy from South Kolkata, middle class and upper class individuals. That's not who we created SAFO for. Will Sappho go and stand next to the Gramir Mein, the rural lesbian? Here we come full circle in our backward and forward story of queer feminist activism. Born out of resistance to homophobic exclusion and silencing, even at the hands of mainstream feminists, Sappho began its journey firmly attached to pervasive models and normative ideals of Indian feminism. It was deeply attached to the political balance of autonomy and wary of the dangers of co-option. As the risk of co-option intensified with increased queer visibility in the neoliberal present, so did the desire to embody a politics of moral purism and cultural authenticity in backward forms of activism. While queer feminists developed critical politics to homo-capitalist and homonormative futures, as I show in the book, they also instituted other kinds of norms and disciplines in which exclusions and inequalities, particularly those marked by class biases, locational and social hierarchies, endured. In order to assuage, for instance, their own class and metrocentric limits, queer feminists produced the grassroots as a space outside of time and place, as rarefied Bengali rurality with a pure feminist subject to speak on behalf of and to save. In so doing, they reproduced the very logics by which the politics of sexuality had been historically dismissed vis-a-vis the politics of poverty in the post-colony. Ultimately, however, SFE was haunted by its failure to penetrate the grassroots and reach its subjects. The Gramir Mein haunted metropolitan feminists for their failure to interrogate their own metrocentric limits and class caste biases, but also fortified in her assumed passivity and reification their own subjectivity and agency. Spectral figures and their capacities to haunt the post-colonial present have been hailed for their capacity to disrupt global temporalities and their hegemonic subjects. But my story of post-colonial haunting comes to a different conclusion. For millennial queer feminists, the burdens of the past, its unfinished business and afterlives, did not propel the telling of different stories of Indian feminism, of its subjects and objects. On the contrary, the normative weight of the past served to sustain imperial tropes like the rescue fantasy and relations of paternalism and othering in ways that reproduced rather than challenged structural inequalities within non-Western metropolitan feminisms. Post-colonial hauntings produce defensiveness, a notion I take from Jennifer Nash, as a key feminist affect in the neoliberal present, even as this moment contained the possibility of encountering the ghosts of the past in a different way and of telling feminist stories differently. Thank you.